But science is turning more and more to this kind of jungle to find out why our kind of jungle is becoming more violent. Anthropologists have defined this, the Bora tribe, as a non-violent society. They live communally, under one big roof. Nobody's wealthy, they're not very religious. The children share in the responsibilities, but no adult gets harsh with them if they get out of line. From the moment of birth right through adolescence, they get nothing but the strongest physical affection. It's this contact, the nursing, the touching, the cuddling, that may be the key to the nonviolent society, not the fact that they're far removed from the horrors of civilization. In our own North American tribe, not only is violence generally on the increase, but recent studies show that violence within the family is much greater than anyone thought. In Canada, 1 killing in every 6 is a family affair. In the United States, nearly 2 million husbands or wives have faced an angry mate wielding a knife or gun or even a 2x4. These are the results from just one night of violence in Detroit. External pressures may trigger violence, but why is the potential there in the first place? Psychologists like Dr. James Prescott look to our childhood for clues, to the amount of loving that we got from our parents.
And what I found was that the cultures which provided high infant physical affection were very low in physical violence as adults.
Dr. Prescott looked at 49 primitive cultures and found that by far the majority were peaceful. He found they treated their children with affectionate tolerance, the same tolerance they showed to adult sexuality. It was a different story in the tribes that were notoriously ferocious. They either treated their kids harshly or their adults because of repressive sexual taboos. Prescott set out to prove the inverse relationship of violence and affection by studying what happens to monkeys who don't get any mothering. He already knew that an orphan monkey would cling to any furry substitute that reminded him of mom. But he was interested in something else that he observed in primitive societies. The amount of movement that went with mothering. In the jungle, the two were almost synonymous. Monkeys, too, needed a mother to swing with, even if it's a surrogate. Prescott's colleagues gave one monkey a substitute mother that moved. The other had a surrogate, too, but it was stationary. The first monkey developed normally. He enjoyed being picked up and caressed. The one with the stationary surrogate didn't. He was withdrawn, would cling to his furry surrogate in fear, and if someone reached to pick him up, his little body went rigid with resistance. When he was put back in his cage, he went into neurotic rocking behavior. What do these experiments tell us? A lot about the craving for physical contact. These children have spent all their lives in institutions where the nursing staff didn't have the time to pick them up very often. Their rocking motion is typical, and the longer they're neglected, the more their behavior pattern begins to resemble the monkeys. They start banging their heads. This craving for movement may give us an insight into abnormal or retarded children. Here we see a little boy who's suffering from DeLange syndrome. It's a form of retardation marked by hyperactivity, failure to talk, a lack of emotion and awareness of the environment, and a distaste for being held. He hits himself repetitively and hides behind his hands. But if he's swung around vigorously, he smiles with pleasure, and his eyes are able to keep a steady focus for an extended period. Tests have shown that all children with DeLange syndrome react the same way to vigorous movement. The monkeys tell us more about the severe effects of infant deprivation. The ones that were reared in isolation just don't behave normally when they're finally given a playmate. They rarely touch, and when they do, the contact's surprisingly vicious. Does sensory deprivation affect the brain as well? This is the cerebellum cortex of a monkey brain, the part that registers both movement and touch. Prescott and his colleagues cut away a small layer of cells, the ones they thought hadn't developed. When they'd finished, the monkey began to behave normally. Its aggressive behavior stopped. The experiment was designed to prove that the brain's changed by deprivation of sensory stimulus. It wasn't an operation to cure violence. Can we apply this to humans?
I think one of our best examples of this is child abuse. Studies have shown that parents who batter their children have a history of deprivation of physical affection, the lack of so-called mothering.
We know there are incidents of child abuse like this the world over. Studies now show that most parents who batter their children were usually victims of abuse themselves. I spoke to one man for whom the memory of childhood's a lasting nightmare.
And my father, he never beat a person on the backside. It was always a face and with a belt. And I would go to school with my face blistered, swollen up, my neck. And there was times I just felt like just hiding. Didn't want to go anywhere.
How often would this sort of thing happen? Once a week or once a month?
Every day. Every day, homework, the first thing you do was the belt was off and I was getting a beating for something. If something went wrong at work, he took it out on me or my mother, either one. 90% of the time it was myself. I wasn't scared of him. There's no way. But I often told him that when I got older, he wouldn't push me anymore because I'd fight back.
Greg took it as long as he could and then set out on his own. But he couldn't forget, and he made the mistake of going home again.
I'm down home for a visit. I figured I'd give it a try. And when I walked into the house, from the kitchen sink to the front room, there was nothing but blood on the floor. So I followed the pool of blood, and in the front room, Mother was on the floor, my father sitting on top of her, punching her in the face. And she had her nose broke, her jaw was broke, her arm was broke. There was 2 or 3 cracked ribs. And I grabbed him by the hair, and I drug him outside, and I started to beat on him. And I wouldn't stop. I used my fists, my feet. I used a 2x4 on him. I used a lead pipe on him. And somebody called the police. The police came. And they took me off top of my father. And I was charged with attempted murder.
Greg got 6 years for attempted murder. He served his time, and he's now living in Toronto. But he's worried and determined to keep himself under control. He joined Parents Anonymous, an organization set up to help parents who abuse their children, because he knows better than anyone else the kind of touching a child gets affects its development. Prescott claims it's our Judeo-Christian tradition that's responsible. Mortification of the flesh is good for us. Pain and punishment build character. Touching for physical pleasure is wrong. And that's the root of our distorted attitude to sex.
We have legal authorities taking action against pornographic films, against massage parlors. It's right out of Corinthians. In contrast, we have a whole variety of films of sexual violence, and that isn't even touched. So we have Clockwork Orange, Straw Dogs. We have many films of sexual violence, particularly rape, which can run in our neighborhood theaters, and there is no objection by the authorities for this kind of sexual violence. So it's not sexuality that is the issue. The issue is pleasure. Pleasure is immoral.
But in our society, punishment is not. According to the latest figures, we've now got more than 22,000 people behind bars, and we know what happens.
Our prison system couldn't be designed better to make the problems worse, because it's isolation, it's deprivation. We're doing all those things which in fact contributed to the problem in the first place.
Well, what would you do?
Well, I would put them into an institution which is secure so that the community is safe, and provide ways and means of retraining, re-educating their sensory system to experience pleasure. Now, this is not the only sort of line of therapy, but I would, use whirlpool baths. I would use massage, physical affection, physical pleasure, sexuality. It would be a difficult program to implement, as you know. I mean, we're closing down massage parlors in our cities with non-violent individuals.
Our society frowns on physical pleasure even for its law-abiding citizens, let alone the ones we put behind bars. Imagine the public outcry for any government that dared supply swimming pools and saunas for its prisoners instead of cells like this. It would be political disaster. But considering the success rate of conventional rehabilitation measures, maybe it's worth taking the risk. Or maybe it's too late for us. But what about our children? Will they miss out too?